days especially. Today to talk about the Old Covenant from the point of view of Christianity, and then tomorrow to talk about the New Covenant. We will be looking at books of the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews, the letter to the Romans, and the Gospel according to John, primarily. And why those books specifically, as much as anything, because I've been reading them a lot and studying them in other groups, and I realized there are similar themes that run and throughout all three of them that are talked about a little differently and kind of the same. And some of the core suggestions for what it means to live as Christians in our world today, I don't hear people talking about, even in the church. And I thought, I'd like to think about that a little bit more, and then if I'm going to do that work, I might as well talk about it so that I don't have to then also come up with a separate retreat topic that I might or might not be as interested in. So that's kind of where we arrived at, how we arrived at where we are. Although it is much bigger than that. And I think it's important to emphasize here for this weekend that what we're doing, although it will be very much rooted in Scripture, is not Bible study, it is retreat. And there is a difference. So in a retreat we have pulled away from the world. In military context, a retreat is not necessarily a defeat, but instead it is a backing off and a chance to kind of regroup and to re-strategize and to reassess so that you can then go back into, again, military battle refreshed and ready to hopefully achieve victory. And that is our goal here as well. So that while we will be looking at the Scriptures, we're not doing so only to say, oh, isn't that interesting, but to help get our lives on track and ourselves ready to re-enter the world, hopefully refreshed, rejuvenated, and ready to conquer. So, that said, again, this is a Turning to God's Word retreat. We'll be very rooted in the Bible. Most of you, not all, are involved in ongoing in one of our printed studies or in my group or both. So, for those who aren't familiar, what we do is very rooted in the idea of Lectio Divina, which is the Church's ancient method of reading the Scriptures. Comes in 4 parts. It's in the little booklets you have, handouts. I don't know the page.
There's an outline there at the back. The outline's at the back.
But I will talk briefly about it as well. And
third page from the back.
To us here as
in
well.
your folder.
The first part of reading and studying the Bible is Lectio, or reading. And already we've hit part that Catholics don't get right way too often. We don't even get to the reading of the Bible a lot of times. And when we do go to study, all too often I think we study what someone else had to say about the Bible, and I got into it that way as well, right? I started reading books by Scott Hahn before I would ever read the Scriptures, and I think, oh, I know what this text means. I hadn't even read the text. So there were little spots here and there where I thought I knew something about what the Bible said without having the context for the book and so he can say the most brilliant things ever, and sometimes does, and that's not Bible study. That's study, it has its place, but the emphasis of Lectio Divina, the first thing we need to do is read and think about what the Scripture says. And the majority of what we do with Turning to God's Word, I would say, really falls into that category. In our studies, a lot of the questions that we look at are things that really focus on making sure that we've caught what the text is actually saying. And we figured out it's really easy to miss things that are going on or to not make connections to other parts of the text. And so learning to read the Bible correctly can be, just as a book, is a thing that can take a lot of study and a lot of time and a lot of concentration. And we encourage everyone to do that. But again, we're here on a retreat, and my goal is not just to educate you. Hopefully you'll learn a few things, and I'll tell you I'm far more comfortable in the sphere of helping people learn something intellectually about what's going on in these things. One of the things that I was talking to my spiritual director about how we're going to be doing this retreat, and he emphasized, remember Matthew, that this is a retreat and not a Bible study, and that people are here for more than an intellectual reason and we're trying to get deeper, which is consistent with where I was planning to go, but it was good to have that reinforcement, and hopefully we will all be stretched a little bit out of our comfort zone here. So once we know what the scripture says, then the Lexio, first part, we move into the second part, Meditatio, which in the past I've described, I think not entirely accurately, as a chewing over and a trying to figure out more and more what it says. And while that's true, I think more precisely that thinking about, that meditation is on how it applies in our lives and in our world. And kind of, so I have, in recent months, as I've been getting a little more serious about my prayer life, pretty frequently had something that I've been reading or hearing about or studying in a Bible study group on my mind that I keep coming back to and thinking about as I'm living my life. And I think that's more, the word meditatio comes from the idea of a cow chewing the cud. So it's kind of like an ongoing chewing thing. And the idea being, so first you know what it says, then how is this speaking to me is the thing that we kind of turn over and think through and through. To the point that I can read a passage and I know that it's trying to say something to me and it just eats at me because I don't know what it is. And I just have this feeling of, I don't get this. And then hopefully then the scriptures become something that we live, that are always on our minds and in our hearts and traveling with us as we try to work through that. And that we are going to attempt here in this retreat as a group to work through even some of that, of applying the concepts. I don't think it will take too long for us all to understand some of the core components of these concepts, and then I want to make sure that we hopefully also understand how they fit in our world, in our church, and in our lives. And so that will be our goal as well. From there, the third part of Lectio Divina is Oratio, prayer. So reading and studying the scriptures are really letting God speak to us. When we get to the prayer, we get to speaking back. Prayer rooted in, God, I understand, I heard you, I get it, I need to do whatever, or I'm thankful for this, or whatever, is a prayer speaking back to God in response to what we have heard and understood from what He is saying to us. And then finally, and this happens sometimes, sometimes not, in studying the Bible, contemplatio, or contemplation, is if we're studying the Bible and we feel drawn into the presence of God, that's a good sign. Stop studying the Bible and focus on the presence of God, because that's what we're really trying to do, is draw closer to God. So if by grace God chooses to let us skip some of the earlier classes and pulls us into His presence as we're reading and studying, then do that, and you can always read the Bible later. Don't say, God, no, I know you want to speak with me now, but I've got to read my Bible right now. It's really maybe not the right approach. So, and ideally then this living daily with the Word is the thing that helps us find that presence of God and experience it more in our lives. And when it happens, that should be our primary focus. So, what we do with turning to God's Word and the way we as Catholics approach, or have approached for well over 1,000 years reading the Bible, is summed up in those four things. We will do far less of the praying, and I don't think, even if I were, unless I'm absorbed beyond my power by some mystical experience, I will not stop talking in order to enter into prayer. I think if one of you zones out, I'll assume you're not asleep, but that you're in deep contemplation. but I will work on not doing that. So in our group Bible study, of course, we do focus most on what does the Bible actually say, and some on how does it apply to our lives in the world. The rest of it is left personally for all of us to do, but there is ripe opportunity for prayer here at the monastery, so that would be good as well. So that is kind of the quick overview. We will be, as I said, talking about the law of life and the law of death, the new and the old covenants respectively. We will be talking, among other things, about how life and death, as outlined for us in Christianity, are at play in our world today and in our society. And I think we do less. It would be ideal from an evangelization point of view if our faith seeped ever more into society. When we let it go the other way, that maybe creates some problems. And that will, even when we can easily view ourselves as living in a Christian society, one of my contentions is that's maybe not so much as we might think. So we'll be talking some about that. But before we do that, we'll get some groundwork, because again, it's always great to and important to be rooted in the scriptures when we do these things, because that is how we help keep ourselves on the right track and make sure we're not letting ourselves be influenced by things that maybe aren't quite right. So far, so good?
Did you make up all these answers?
Mom and Tammy did some of them. I did quite a bit of it.
We all had fun with it. We thought it was a good time. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yes.
So, we will be looking at 3 primary books this weekend. And if you do have extra time in your room and you feel like being an overachiever, reading through any part of one of or all of these books would certainly not be a fruitless exercise, since I will be picking some choice passages that I think really highlight specifically where we're trying to go, and we'll not have time for all of it. I will give you a little bit of background on each of them to make sure we understand what was, just how they all fit together, and the context in which they were written, and a little bit of all of that. So, after Jesus came, there was, it's not that he came and everybody understood everything right away and we knew all of a sudden how to live as Christians and everything that he meant. There was certainly a period in which these books were written when people were trying to figure out what he meant. For people from a Jewish background, whether Christian or not, there was the idea he had not been the Messiah as people thought that that the Messiah was going to be. So even if you decided this Jesus guy, he was the real deal and he was the Messiah, there was still Roman occupation in Jerusalem. He was not the political figure a lot of people thought the Messiah would be, as David had been. And so there is a lingering question of what exactly did he do? He came to offer salvation and to change the rules for how people interact with God, which he did. But the question of how exactly that worked and how it manifests in our lives was extremely relevant to the early church and remains so today. And so these books are people at somewhat different times, talking to somewhat different audiences, trying to explain what it is that he did and how it affects the way that we should live. And I think by comparing and contrasting, I hope, some of these different approaches to answering that question, we can come up with a way that we can answer it ourselves. A different way to ask the same, I think a similar version of the same question is, and I left some of you who at the end of the dinner for the Des Moines group on Wednesday with the question, and I'll start today with it as well, is what is the new covenant? We say Jesus came and made a new covenant. At least if you've been in our studies, hopefully you can articulate the old one, at least in a simple form. But we say there is a new covenant. What is it? What are the terms of it? How are we supposed to live? It's not written down in one simple, super clear statement anywhere. This is the new covenant and this is what I'm supposed to do. And there is a reason for that. And we will dig into that at great length tomorrow. Today we'll be laying framework. But all three of these different books take a slightly different approach to explaining it. I think they come up with a very similar conclusion with regards to what it is. So that will be where we're going is, first, what was the old covenant? How does it come to play in Christianity? What is the new covenant? And how do we live it? So overall roadmap, that's it. But these books have been selected because they all have a slightly different take, and I think by comparing and contrasting all of them, we can, with a little grace, come up with a good answer to that question. So we do not know who the author to the letter of the Hebrews was. There was quite a while people thought it might have been St. Paul, but they generally agree now that it wasn't. And I tend to think that as well. The writing style is not the same. It was based on how it references and describes the temple. It was very likely written prior to 70 AD when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And scholars think maybe 63, 64 AD. It was written specifically to people who are intimately familiar with and practitioners of Judaism. The case is very strongly, this is that Jesus is a Jewish fulfillment, and all of these Jewish things point to Jesus, and he's acting very much in that context. And so the letter to the Romans is very much a bridging from Judaism into Christianity. By contrast, the letter to the Romans was written by St. Paul. It was written to a Roman Christian community with Gentile roots. And as such, it takes, without contradicting the letter to the Hebrews, takes kind of an opposite approach that you don't need, we as everyday people don't need to have been Jewish to be Christian. And the Jewish law and covenant was necessary to get to where we are, but is not necessary for us. And talks about how some of that works. And finally, the Gospel according to John is a little bit farther down the line. It was written either by John the Evangelist himself or by someone who was very familiar with him in his community of teaching. Scholars tend to think it was written on or after 90 AD, so it was on the late side for it to have actually been John the Evangelist. But it also, they think, went through 2 or 3 different fairly major drafts or revisions, so it's possible. At any rate, it is from the tradition of John the Evangelist for sure. It was also likely written to people familiar with Judaism and with some of the Jewish background, although clearly by then the church had figured out, this 30 years later, people had started to figure out that Christianity existed for Jews and Christians alike, and it addresses much less the question of your background. It was a lot more, presents Jesus a lot more as clearly for everyone, and the new covenant as a thing that is accessible to everyone with no prerequisites in the old. So we will look at I think John helps unite some of the themes and ideas in Hebrews and in Romans. So we will take a look at all of those things, hopefully, at least a little bit. How are we doing? Good. Questions so far? That'll get us through some of the background. So, big things we are going to be talking about this weekend are life and death. what I found to be very interesting when I started trying to figure out how I would actually convey some of the ideas I had on this and the thoughts, is these are not so easy to define in the Bible at all. Anybody want to take a stab on our life and death?
I can tell you what Benedict Rochelle tells you life is, how you tell the difference. He said, if something's alive, it moves around and leaves little messes. That's not a biblical definition. That's
right.
cute.
So that would be life is animate, right?
Yeah.
Breath? How about breath?
Inanimate,
Breath is
yeah.
good. Breath is good. Good suggestion.
And breathing. Not breathing. You can likewise talk about that in terms of things like the beating of the heart and some other things. There are, in general, there would be some other versions of the same idea of what we would call our mortality, right? The physical characteristics of the things that are our daily experience of what it is to be alive. But of course in the scriptures we talk about death more broadly than that as well, which is where we get into trouble. And I want to talk a little bit also by way of background about, as all things tend in Bible study tend to go back to the early parts of Genesis, specifically the second creation account. We won't read it all, it's not too long. It starts in Genesis chapter 2, if anyone wants to read through it at some point. I highly recommend it. But God creates, it's the second instance of the creation of humanity, and it's the one that includes Adam and Eve. How does God create Adam?
Breathes.
He breathes, yes, into a lump of clay, and it is a person. And it's from that, so it is then the idea from the beginning that this life that is in humanity is a thing that very much comes not from us but from God, is a thing that is in us. We will look at Genesis 2:16 to 17 here that I can read. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. So, we have this life. It has been given to us by God. And from the beginning, really from the beginning, there is a rule put in place that says there is something that you can do that will lead you to die. And that is, we are going to talk about every iteration or mention or talking about the Old Covenant is some form of death. It is, as life comes to be, God also sets down rules or law governing, describing how living things become dead. And the first one is, if you do this thing that I have told you you cannot do, and I'm going to draw here one more thing. We're going to put a little line here between life and death. The old covenant, there is law in place for how we cross this way. It is dealing almost entirely with this is how things die. And it is through sin. This gap here, this is very much, this gulf is sin or disobedience to God, is the thing that separates life from death. Following along so far? But then again, we come back to the question, what is life and what is death? What happens when, Adam and Eve wandering around naked in the garden. God tells them what they can't do, and tells them that they will die if they do it. They do it. What happens? They both drop dead and there's no more humanity, right? Oh wait, no, that's not what happened. What did happen?
They get embarrassed.
They get banished from the garden. And they do eventually die, by the way we've been talking, by the most obvious forms of life and death. They become mortal, if they weren't before. It's not entirely clear, but it's possible that they were not. But to truly live, that's not a thing that's ever going to leave. Because that is a form of death in and of itself. So they go from people who are undying to people who will eventually die. But more importantly, and I think Deb hit the nail exactly on the head, they are banished from the garden and from the presence of God. So we've got a number of different ways that life and death can look in the scriptures. There is the physical manifestation we see, but I think especially as we see that it is God himself that made humanity live from the beginning through his breath, that it is the loss mostly of presence of God that leads to mortality and the degradation even of the flesh, and ultimately what we would call death. We hit an interesting problem. We believe that the soul is immortal, right? Once you exist, once you are never not, so that death can't be ceasing to exist. So it's not we hit an area where the natural metaphor, we'll talk about at length how so this is, I probably should have used a different color, but this part at least is nature, right? It's something we can observe, we see, and it is the way the world around us works. Again, because we live in a world that is governed by death. We can see around us things dying. In a way where we don't see things coming back to life. We see new life coming to be, but that's not the same thing. We don't see, it is not a part of our natural experience. This covenant, this law of and governance of death is a thing that reigns in the world in which we live. Yes,
Matthew, just reading this is such a rich statement. It seems to me the sin is obviously disobeying God.
Yep.
The result of the sin is that we have knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil renders us subject to death. So it's the knowledge of good and evil that we shall die, not rendered to us, but we shall die because we have the knowledge of evil. Can you expiate a little?
Absolutely. And we've got in here, this is exactly where we were going. No, do ask questions.
But
Good job, George.
the enemy had been messing with the world from the get-go, long before human beings.
And was right there to corrupt the new creation of humanity.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you say we don't see things coming to life, you're talking about living, breathing things?
Coming back to life.
You're talking about
He said we don't see them coming back to life. We
Back.
see new life, we don't see them coming back
Yeah.
to life.
back to life.
Yeah, because of course there is new life, but
But you're talking about living, breathing,
yeah.
people, animals, things like that.
They
Not
don't die
necessarily
and then we
nature,
see them
Not
pop
God's
back.
creation and nature, plants, water purification, things like that. You're talking about breathing things.
I am,
People.
right, yeah. But I even, like, plant life. Winter comes and things look dead, but of course they're not. And at the point that a tree actually dies, there's no making it a tree again.
Okay.
So, to George's question, we've got this line from Romans that we'll get into the first time here now and then get back to. Romans 5:13. Sin indeed was in the world before the law is given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Just back to George's point in question, that it is knowledge of good and evil that creates the fundamental problem. Is you can do whatever you want if you don't know it's wrong. But for whatever reason, and I will talk about whatever reason, I'm not going to leave that hanging as the point that is just left for us to guess about. For whatever reason, God decided to have some things be wrong and some things be okay. And told from the beginning when humanity was created, there was a rule. There was, you can do anything you want, but you can't do this thing. And so from the beginning of humanity, there was an expectation put on us by God. He gave us life and he said, these are the terms of service. This is what you have to do to continue to live. And so we knew that, and as long as we didn't transgress that rule, we were fine. And then, of course, we did anyway. So the way the story tells it, knowledge was much simpler before the fruit was consumed, because there was only that one rule. And the idea is then that the consumption of the fruit, the knowledge of good and evil, imposed a much broader rule set. Oh, now I know that I'm naked and I'm ashamed, and as an image for now I know many other things that I shouldn't do. My idea of law expanded, but there's still basic premise of if I sin, I die, that governed and governs humanity still persists. There are a few ways to look at how all of that works. An interesting thought that I've had that is, I think, not incompatible with church teaching, but is certainly not a thing that is inherent upon anyone to believe, is the idea of, flirts with the idea of evolution a little bit. So if anybody doesn't care for evolution, church doesn't say you have to believe in evolution. But if you think about the idea that we came from monkeys, at some point, something that is fundamentally an animal is going to become something that is self-aware, like we are as people. And at that point, you have a different awareness of yourself and of the world and your place in it. You know the difference between right and wrong in a different way, but you're still programmed genetically and evolutionarily. You're still programmed as an animal who now has understanding of something more. And so I think that is one way to state and to talk about the human condition is we were created or evolved however you want, or didn't evolve, however you want to believe that. We were for sure created and came to a point where we knew better, and we still have inclinations and draws and pulls to do things even though we know better. And there is the challenge of the covenant that sin leads to death, and there's no way to fix that. So here I am in a point being drawn as by gravity towards sin, and if ever once I give in, I have sinned and I will die. And it's not like a little death. There's only 1 degree of death. You only get to do it once. If once you sin, then always you die. And it seems to be under the old covenant, those are the fundamental terms and rules. If you sin once, ever, then you die. And moreover, humanity does seem kind of set up for that. So, was that an accident? We also believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful God, so we can't say that that was an accident. So then it strongly raises, I think, that idea, the question of why then would God have done it that way? For that, I'd like to, these harder questions we often end up talking about in metaphors, and I'm going to start with the same that I thought of last night while we were singing the choir, of actually a choir. So, for a choir to function and to sound good, the people involved, especially if it's a smaller choir, all need to themselves as individuals be good singers. But just because someone is a good singer does not mean they will be a positive, constructive member of a choir. A good singer individually can be disastrous to a choir if they don't also know how to sing in that effort. We have said, we already talked about it some, and we will continue to talk about it. God became man in order that man might become God. God has created us to participate in union with Him, not only as Adam and Eve were wandering around in the garden, but for us to be invited into the union that is the Trinity. And there are a few things that are required for us to be able to do that. First, we have to be able to sing, if the Trinity is a choir, which means we have to be an individual who has our own thoughts, skills, abilities, our own self. And to do that, we have to be free to be an individual, to make choices and to act as an individual. And so we have to have will. So God set us up to learn to be an I. And in becoming an I, we were bound to make some mistakes. And so the Old Covenant governs how that works, is humanity is learning to be individuals. But also to participate, we have to learn how to sing as part of the choir. We have to learn how to be a we. We have to learn not just to act on the I, but to act for the we. So we'll see in the New Covenant, we'll see a way that we can learn to participate fully, and we can deal with the consequence of sin that comes up initially. In the meantime, I think it probably took us quite a while to fully understand ourselves and God enough to be ready for the full invitation of the New Covenant as a people. Just having awareness, consciousness, and will, I think it took us a while to grow into it. The gift that was given enough that we could take the next step and enter into the New Covenant. And we talked a lot more last year at our retreat about how even though we're living in the New Covenant, we clearly have not reached the end state of this human journey yet either. We still have work to do now. We are still journeying as well. But that this New Covenant has given us the means to do it. So, human state, condition, as we found it, continue to find it, we know what is wrong, and we cannot always avoid doing it. Does that sound fair to everyone? And so these rules talk about how that works and interplays between us and life and death. We're specifically going to look at the Old Covenant from a Christian point of view, but we should take a little bit of time to talk about how it's set up. How is the problem of sin dealt with in the Old Testament? There's one major way that comes about. If I sin, then I have committed a mortal offense. Death is owed to God. What was the earlier way of attempting to pay that debt?
Kill an animal.
Kill an animal. So, because I sinned, God is owed a life. Here, have this cow. And hopefully you'll take that in trade, is the idea. And the history of the people, God's people in the Old Testament, shows God used this natural or this physical manifestation of life and death to teach people that that's what works, that's what's going on. So in the Old Testament, you can potentially save your physical, animated, breathing, heart-pumping life by, you can at least defer its death by, when you have sinned, by offering a life in exchange. And it tends to work mostly on the level of what we can see before us. And we'll dig into that here a little bit more. Everybody with me so far? Let's start with the letter to the Hebrews then, in terms of how we look at all of this. Hebrews doesn't talk that much about life and death. It does it more in terms of entering into God's rest, and uses the Sabbath idea a little bit, which shows in the garden, we saw in the creation story, we saw the garden very much as a form of God's rest. Right? Humanity did not have to toil for food, and they were in the presence of God. Which is not to say that we are trying to get back to something like that, because even that was an image or a shadow pointing to the thing that is to come, which is God's rest in the letter to the Hebrews is we are in union with, in the presence of God, and there is nothing we have to worry about ever again, and that includes death. We will never die, we no longer have to, and that rest implies we no longer have to worry about the human problem of we are inclined towards sin. It's safety. The word salvation actually comes from a root that means safety. We can come finally to a place where we no longer have to fight or journey or struggle or worry. And we can come to a point where we rest wholly in God. And so Hebrews already looks at it not in terms of life and death as I'm breathing or I'm not breathing, but as I'm either safe in that way or I'm not. And until I'm that, I am some version of dead or potentially dead. And you are only truly safe when there's not only is there no longer death, there's no longer the potential for death. So entering into God's rest. And the thing that separates us from that is the same as we saw in the garden, it's disobedience. Hebrews 3:18-19 here. And to whom did he swear that they should never enter his rest? But to those who were disobedient. So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. So, and the rest being referred to here is the Old Testament image of the promised land, of the people wandering in the wilderness and not following along with God, and so not being allowed to enter the promised land. But we see the thing that separates humanity from God here is, again, disobedience and unbelief. So far, so good? Mm-hmm. Let's see what Hebrews 10:1-4 has to say. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices which are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? If the worshippers had once been cleansed, they would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sin year after year. For it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. This again is someone functioning with the benefit of hindsight, and looking from a Christian point of view after seeing what Jesus Christ did at Jewish religious practice. And there are a few extremely important insights here for us and for how we look at this. First, we talk about, in scripture study, we talk a fair amount about the idea of typology, about something in the Old Testament being a type or an image of something that was achieved in Christ. The author to the letter of the Hebrews talks about it as shadows. The things of the Old Testament and even the Old Covenant itself are shadows of something to come. So as though and what's the shadow, right? The sun shines on me, the version of me in the light. You can see all the detail, pink shirt, blue glasses, whatever. But down on the ground, you see just an outline, just in black. So it's not as vibrant. It's just, at best, a colorless outline. That's how we can think of so many things in the Old Testament. The garden is a shadow of us living in heaven, as is the promised land. The Old Covenant, our life itself, the way we see it and experience it here in this world, is a shadow of what God means by life. And so that we are functionally in this world living ourselves still now in a world of shadows. We are surrounded by outlines of true things. And we have, and we'll talk about it with the New Covenant, we have been given the ability to begin to experience some of the true things even on this earth. But ultimately this world is functionally a world of shadows from that point of view. And even the things God has given us to start to understand Him are shadows of the true heavenly things that we're working toward. And so this ultimately as well, bless you, and especially the ways in the Old Covenant that we looked at moving back from death to life through sacrifices are only shadows. They're only things to point the way, and they're not themselves the real thing. And we can tell that, the author says, because once something is dead and you offer a sacrifice, you have to keep doing it. You haven't fixed the problem. We see, I killed a bull, I have to do it again and again and again, and never is the fundamental root inclination to sin removed. So at best, I have taken away some of the guilt of my sin, but I haven't fixed the fact that death is pulling me with a force like that of gravity back toward it. And I haven't escaped into orbit, so to speak, so that I'm free from that pull of death. And so I need to keep offering over and over and over again. And even that, it doesn't take away sin, is the point. And looking back in hindsight with Jesus Christ, we can see, yeah, of course, killing an animal didn't take away my sins. But before the rules changed, that was all that there was. You can either do that, which you've been told by God is the thing you can do, or you can do nothing. That was certainly better than nothing. It could at least save this life, if not the shadow of life that we are trying to get back to. It's better than nothing, but the letter to the Hebrews says that's not it. That's what we need. That's not what we need. So, and then we see more comments about the insufficiency of the Old Covenant. Hebrews 7:18-19. On the one hand, the former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. So, Old Covenant, again, when speaking here of the Old Covenant, the author is talking about the things that potentially, again, would try to help people move back to life. The sacrifices are weak, they can't really fix the problem, useless. If they haven't fixed the problem, then what's the point? They have made nothing perfect. And the goal of humanity is that we be made perfect, that we get to a point where we are living, and even if this rule is still in place, it is not a threat to us. It is not a thing that we don't have to worry about death, that we have life and have it securely. And since murdering animals is not a sufficient way to do that, it's really not very useful. Which is why we don't do that anymore, by the way. It's because it is, among other things, but society has evolved away from that to the point that we see that as really quite ridiculous now. But it's because we found another way. a better way, something that works, that we don't have that as a part of our daily or regular liturgical practice. So if there is so very much to thank Jesus Christ for, but one of the things is that we don't have to routinely murder animals to try to, as part of our worship, to try to eke out some little portion of salvation. It is a thing we take for granted how nice it is that we don't have to do that. We really have it pretty good. Also Hebrews 8:13. In speaking of a new covenant, he treats the first as obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. I especially like the idea of obsolescence as we look at this, because it says it served a purpose. If it never was able to fully achieve what we would hope we would get to, and is ultimately for that reason useless, it did serve a purpose. I have a 20-year-old computer sitting in a garage somewhere I would never use for anything now, right? Totally useless for anything I would want to do. But it's because software and function has come so far that it just can't keep up with anything I would want to. I'm trying to do better things now. But when I was only trying to do the things that computer could do, it could, of course, by the end, barely do those. But at some point, it could do some things. It just can't do what is possible now. Same with the Old Covenant. It could do some things, but it couldn't do the things we're trying to do. The things it could do were it could keep a bolt of lightning from striking me when I cursed my parent. But it couldn't make me live again once I'm dead, which is ultimately what we want to do, because none of us avoid sin forever. What we really need is a way to bring something that is dead back to life. That's the only way that we will ever be safe from death, is if death is not forever, if death is not binding, is we have to have a way to bring a thing that is dead, in the full sense of the word dead, back to life. And the Old Covenant does not do that. And because it does not do that, it does not have the oomph I need. I can't get out of orbit. I can't escape the gravitational pull of death that sucks me in and I'm there for good. But it's just that it's obsolete. It is still a way, the Old Covenant still allows a way of saying, God, I'm sorry. I'm saying, please don't strike me by lightning or swallow me in an earthquake or strike me dead. God killed so many people in so many ways in the Old Testament. It was everywhere, and it's because that is the world we live in. There is no death that happened to anyone in the Old Testament that they were undeserving of. Everyone had sinned. Everyone was living, if you will, in death. So when hordes and hordes and armies of people got killed, they were all experiencing the death that was already theirs by justice and by right and by the law. The surprising thing is that people didn't drop dead immediately when they sinned. God allowed people, for the sake of people to exist, to continue breathing after they sinned. But of course that's because, as we know, that's not really life. And they did lose life in its fullest sense immediately upon sin, as do we still. It's just that now, this was never annulled to the point that it doesn't apply. And we'll talk about how we get around that. We still live under the rule of, if we sin, we die. The difference is that now we have a way to come back from the dead. Whereas in the Old Covenant, we did not. How we do?
Nice.
So, sin then creates a fundamental divide. Color did I have? Well, this works. We're going to go ahead and say that life also is God, and death also is. I'm going to use the last version of that, because otherwise it'll drive me crazy. By nature, God himself is life. And we, from the beginning, have fallen into a place where we're fundamentally dead. And this sin, this thing here, disobedience, unbelief, creates a divide between us and God then. And that is the human condition. And Romans will talk some about that.
Matthew, pardon me for, I hope I don't sound pedantic on this. I'm just taken with the kind of enigmatic notion of knowledge and consciousness of sin. And you read from Hebrews 10, 1-4. If the worshipers had once been cleansed, they would no longer have any consciousness of sin, which suggests it would be returning to a state of ignorance as opposed to a state of knowledge, which comes on the death column. So God in life is a sense of ignorance. And am I looking at this right? Is this what Romans has to correct?
It's a good point.
I was going to say, I took it as not meaning consciousness of sin at all, but after they've made the sacrifice, that they don't have sin in them, not that there just isn't any.
I think that hits on some of it. It becomes a thing that there is a way we don't have to worry about. I won't say that Christ came and no one anymore has to worry about sin. The new covenant will dictate what it is that allows us to pass from death to life. But if we are doing what we need to come back from the dead, then sin is not a thing that needs to be on our mind or of concern to us. And in the Old Covenant, you'll see there are 10 commandments. There are these specific rules. Follow these rules. That's not how we do it now. We do something else. So even the law that we're subject to and how it works to make us, let's say, immune from death, changes. So that it's not however many rules you want to have. And so it ends up being a thing that works differently, which is not to say there's not still a law and some, obviously, right and wrong. It's, I think, both what Deb was saying, there's I don't have to be conscious of past sin because it has not killed me. Or it did, but I'm alive again. I have come back to life. So I don't have to live in consciousness of once when I was 12 I stole something, I haven't committed any other sin, but I'm still dead, so I have to think about that all the time. I don't have to worry about what I did because I have come back to life. I only have to worry about what I do. And even in that I can be secure under certain conditions. I don't want to spoil all of tomorrow's talk.
George, something that's interesting to think about, it's a little bit related, but you might not see it right away. In paragraph 760 in the Catechism, it says the world was created for the sake of the church. That flips what we usually think. We usually think, okay, the church is created, because the world is here first, and then there's the church. But if you think about it the other way, then it changes how you think about the Old Covenant quite a bit. I think it does. It changes how I think about it.
More, please.
Well, I don't want to get too far in Matthew's time, but we can talk about it at lunch or sometime if you want to. But I find that just a fascinating statement that the Catechism makes, and completely off of what I expected to find. You read along in the Catechism and you think, yeah, I know it, and then you go, wait a minute, I didn't know that. And
from that point of view, we would add here also, the church is the entity by which humanity participates in divinity. Which we'll get into tomorrow.
Yeah, it's kind of legal back to the garden in a state of innocence and ignorance. That was not perfection. There's also a place in the Catechism, which I can probably find if I look a little while, that says that, the Garden of Eden is not perfection. God had a better plan, more beyond that. So we're not trying to get backwards in that sense. We don't want to become Adam and Eve and not know anything, which I think is what you were getting at.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
how I read. And it may be that Dennis got it right, that the word consciousness, and as Matthew was saying too, isn't consciousness like we think of it today. Maybe not a state of ignorance, but a state of having less need to worry about it.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
What was that number again?
760.
And
760.
say it again.
The world was created for the sake of the church.
That is something.
Yeah, that really is.
Yeah, because you think, well, we didn't have the church till after Jesus came. But then you go back to the Bible, you can say, well, now wait a minute, we had Jesus before we had anything. So maybe we did have the church first. So, and then the catechism says the world was created for the sake of the church.
And all these steps along the way have not been, well, this didn't work, so we're gonna do this.
Correct.
And we're gonna do this, and we're gonna do this. This was all,
God's plan.
part of the master plan, right from the very outset.
Yeah, that does change how you start to look at some of the Old Testament stuff, I think. It changed how I started looking at it.
Oh, it certainly looks like falling back on Plan B, Plan C, Plan D.
Oh, of course it does. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's why the catechism is such a gift. Stop. Something
So when
different.
Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it,
Yeah.
that is profound.
Yep. And the law is a necessary part of how, again, tomorrow, but I think Tammy's not here to start the camera again yet. I think and I'm not sure she left it running.
I think it is.
Oh, it is.
It's
Well,
running.
at any rate, we'll still go ahead and I'll just say the law was necessary, or this old thing was a necessary part of how Jesus achieved salvation. It's just that his way is not the way we take. He was a sort of a trailblazer and found a way that only he could figure out, and then basically posted signs and made a much easier path for us afterwards. But he still had to achieve for us salvation with just this system we're talking about in place. He still had to make it work. And it's just that then because he did, we don't. We'll get to that.
I just have a practical question. Are you going to take a break, or should we just take a break when we need one?
Just take a break when you need to.
Yeah, just
Perfect.
Yeah.
walk out, walk
Very
back.
casual.
Get water, get whatever you need.
So, Romans. So, Hebrews then, we saw fuse the Old Covenant, again, being written to Jews, is emphasizing this is useless. Specifically because we don't want to carry old practices into how we live as Christians. The way they tried to atone for and to deal with sin before Jesus is not how we want to try to do it with Jesus. So with the intended audience of that letter, the focus was very much on leave all that behind, it's useless. Or obsolete, again, I like it better still, but the author uses both words. When we get to Romans, the author is writing not to Jews but to Gentiles, so we'll have a bit of a different perspective. Romans 2:12-13. All who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. And I think George just maybe touches a little bit on your question as well. This author views it as just because there's such a thing as wrong, whether you are under the Jewish law or not, you are still damned. Because at some point, all people fundamentally have some awareness in their hearts of right and wrong, and should know better. Whether you've been taught the Ten Commandments and the full Jewish law, or you're just someone living your life, there is a certain extent to which you should know better. And when you have then still not done the better that you know, you find yourself in the same place. The thing that's not in my handout, this will be the first thing that I think of. I didn't mention it at all, but I should have. It's not a reference, it's just, for anybody who's studied much moral philosophy at all, there is a moral principle that persists pretty much throughout different societies, cultures, and types of thought that technically ends up being called the ethic of reciprocity, that we end up calling the golden rule. Treat other people the way you want to be treated, is a thing that is discoverable by reason alone. It's the way we can all figure out whatever we've been taught about how to behave, that makes sense in terms of how we act. And it functions by using me as the standard for which that governs how, if I want you to not do bad to me, then I need to not do bad to you. It works very much in connection with the idea of justice. And it leads to a just society, justice being giving others their due. If everyone acted that way, everyone would more or less get their due. So that whether there is a more precise or deeper law at play or not, there is built into all of us the ability to have some sense of right and wrong. And we all still, back to the statement of the problem, we have all transgressed it. And so whether I'm Jewish or not, whether I've ever been told about the Ten Commandments, potentially no one ever had to tell me, thou shalt not commit murder, for me to know that I shouldn't kill someone. Although apparently we're still debating exactly whether or not we need to follow all parts of that one, even in our society today. So I guess we can make it complicated if we want to, but ultimately that one should be pretty obvious. And then we see here, and this is where Paul's idea gets interesting, 4:15, for the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. Again, Paul is very easy to take out of context, and I'm necessarily doing it because we don't have time to go through all of the letter to the Romans. The project here is to show to the Gentiles that they're at least as good, that they're not worse off than Jews in Christianity. So that the Jewish law and rules, that you're dealing here with the problem of a chosen people. So I'm a Roman. I grew up Roman. My family's been Roman. We were never practicing Jews. But this Jesus guy still came back from the dead, and that still means something. So I decided to sign on for Christianity. I think that's way better than following what they didn't even barely even worship the gods that they worshipped. It was kind of just for fun. Kind of like we talk about unicorns. Some people were a little more serious, but it was not super serious. But then there's this idea of, there is this God, and he's these remote, distant, backwater Jewish people's God, and there might be something to this, and I decided to sign on and to really try to worship. And in the community that I'm in, there are some Christians who also formerly were Jews, and they keep talking about their Jewish law and practices and how they're the chosen people. And I'm a Christian now, and I'm not Jewish, and I'm not chosen, and how do I fit into this new thing? And so here's a guy saying, God gave the law to the Jews, and with it he gave them wrath. He told them more, so more was expected. So by having more rules, they did not have a better situation. In fact, we see that the greater awareness of sin that you have, the more accountability there is. So that by having this old covenant law in greater detail and calling, the chosen people were chosen for additional wrath instead of for, and we've unfortunately seen some of that. I'm not saying Jews deserve horrible fate. Your takeaway from this shouldn't be, I went on this retreat this weekend and Matthew said that the Jews deserve the Holocaust. It's not at all where I'm going with this. But it is nonetheless, so for new people coming in who never were aware of God from the point as the Old Testament laid him out, Paul is saying that's okay, and you can still be a part of this new thing. Christianity doesn't have prerequisites the way college courses do. It's not, you didn't take Judaism 101 so you don't qualify for entry into Christianity 201. You don't have to have been Jewish to be Christian, and that's one of the things they were wrestling with. Paul's way of dealing with that is he explains they had more, and that only brought them more wrath when there wasn't a way. But of course, if there then is a way that we can go back from death to life, then having that more that the chosen people were called to is actually a good thing. And we bring a lot of that into Christianity with us. But you don't have to have been Jewish in the old sense. We have been called to more still because we can take more. We can tolerate being called to even higher level of behavior when we can go from death to life. When we can come back to life from the dead, much more still can be expected of us. So Jesus doesn't make it easy.
Can I give an example? Part of it is having taught second and third grade CCD classes, but when you're trying to explain and you're teaching the 10 Commandments, but it gets really complicated when you're teaching 6 and 7-year-olds, what is covet thy neighbor's wife or all that. But if you just teach them what Jesus said, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, it's so much simpler. And yet it wraps around all 10 Commandments without having get that complicated about it. So I feel that, what you're saying, that's where Christianity is moving, because those two rules, those two laws, which Jesus gave us, are so all-encompassing everything. But that they're so simple.
Well, that's right, but
It's a good
Doesn't have to get so
but the
complicated.
fallback for
Simple as
many
easy.
Christians is still the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emphasis still placed on that.
Yeah. And we'll dig into some of that tomorrow. I think Jesus ultimately takes it even one step farther than that, and we'll talk about that as well. Because I think it's pretty cool. We're not off the hook because we weren't Jewish, and so having a simpler law does not give us an easier law, and there are still expectations. Okay, this I think we've probably already talked about enough, but we should read it and be sure. Romans 5:12-14. Therefore, as sin came into the world through one man, and to death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all men sinned. Sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one to come. This statement is Paul again attempting to say, so it's conveying the fundamental state of humanity has shifted. So Adam and Eve in the garden were alive. They sinned. From that, it's like the bit or the switch that governs how humanity is by default switched from alive to dead. So that it's basically what turned on the gravity, so to speak, and made it so that that initial disobedience and that state of humanity that the state we're in, that we can't avoid sinning and we know better, is the thing that death reigns. We live in a state of death because we've talked about it already. We can't not sin, and so we can't not die. And from Adam down through all humanity, that was true for everyone.
I think he mentions Adam to Moses because he's making the point that Moses then gives them the law.
Yeah.
And so then they got the law, and they're still sinning. They were sinning before they have the law, they're sinning after they have the law.
And they're all dead.
And they're all dead, yeah.
Yeah, from the very first one
From the get-go.
Yeah, everyone's dead. Still good? So, yeah, Romans really working to set apart the idea that for Christians, it's okay if you weren't Jewish, but highlighting everyone before, Jewish or not, the human experience fundamentally becomes the same, and Jews and Gentiles become the same, and that they were all damned by the fact that at some point everyone knows better and does something anyway, when the law written in their hearts and the ones they were told in whatever form was, we knew better and we did wrong. And if you sin, you die. And so there is that problem still. And it affects Jews as badly as Gentiles, was Paul's work to emphasize. So as we come into Christianity, we can all come equal, knowing that we're all coming in a state of death, and we're coming looking for a way to find life. Yeah. And then we've got the Gospel according to John, which talks about this far less explicitly in terms of the problem. John just basically says the world was in darkness, and Jesus came and there was light, and really does not explain too much about the dark, does not really go into great detail about what the darkness looked like or what the problem was. He's far more focused on the solution. But I think it would be fair to say that John looks at part of the problem as one of ignorance. Humanity did not know God. Jesus says all the time throughout the Gospel according to John, I'm the only one who's ever come down from the Father. I'm the only one who's ever seen him. I can tell you about the Father because I and I alone have seen the Father. And so from that point of view, a part of how John's Gospel views the problem of humanity is that we're simply ignorant of who God is. We don't know who God is or how he works. Which is not to say that this isn't still a problem. Even if we know, without Jesus we can't do. But there is a problem even to the level of ignorance, which takes away any claim that the Jews might have had for superior knowledge about who God is. And the Gospel at great length highlights the Jews, especially Jewish leaders, conflicting with Jesus about the best way to do things, far more than, sorry, I'm going to grab some water. My bottle's empty and my throat's scratched. Jesus' biggest conflicts in that gospel are with the Jewish leaders, so they're theoretically having more knowledge. He continually highlights it was all there if you could find it, but that's not what you're looking for. So there's opportunity, and this is an idea that will be useful tomorrow. There's a potentiality or an opportunity in the things of the Old Covenant that allows for Jesus to do what Jesus does. There's a pathway in it that allows for truly coming back to death, or coming back from the dead. But it is not such an easy thing to accomplish. But the potentiality is there from the beginning for all people to live. And as more covenant rules for the forgiveness of sins are put into place, those rules are what are used to allow us to live. It's just not exactly the way people understood and tried to use them. So when Jesus comes and he sees things and knows about things the way God does, then he knows how to follow the rules to achieve the intended result and to really restore the dead to life. Whereas the best other people could make of them was killing some animals. Jesus knew, because he knew God and knew God's intention, how to bring those to bear for real. So, what does John say here? John 1:17-18. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. So, we see a few things there. Again, the idea of sorry, throat still. Jesus being the only one to actually know God, and so he's the one to reveal him. The other point being, what Jesus brought is something that is not the law. So when we look at the new covenant, the old covenant existed. It had a law and it had sacrifices. The new covenant is something that functions differently from the way the old one did. So it achieves a different thing, rather than governing how living things become dead and trying to hedge a little bit there. It governs how dead things become alive, and it works differently. You don't need rules. If you're already on this side, you don't need rules for how you might die, because you're already dead. You need something that can resist the death that comes from sin and nonetheless bring you back over into life. So it doesn't need to be legal in the same sense, because it's not about what you're not doing. It's about what is being offered and what you are doing. And so it necessarily isn't a whole bunch of don't do this or you might lose what you have. Anyway, getting ahead of ourselves.
Can I ask a question, Keith?
Yeah.
So you got this red that's real important.
Yeah.
Old Covenant. So can we do another one down below that's New Covenant?
Yeah, we're
Going in-
absolutely going to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is exactly what we're doing. Yeah. In fact, we can just go ahead and
Let's do that right now.
I've talked about it enough. It's not. Like
We know that's happening, so let's put it on.
Jumping the gun here. Sorry.
No, it's good that you know.
I was just hoping there'd be a
Yeah.
circle going.
Yeah. And then we see also, I think this is a useful idea to keep in mind in John's Gospel from the 4th chapter. Jesus is not talking to a Jew here, or to an Israelite, yes, probably. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such the Father seeks to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So the question she asked Jesus before this is,
You
our
people say.
Samaritans, worship on this mountain, and you people, Jews, say the place to worship in Jerusalem, which is it? And Jesus says, well, from how it's been up until now, probably technically Jerusalem, but that's what's been, but the new thing is coming where that doesn't matter. And
Now it
where
is.
worship changes. So there is no longer a right place, and to a certain extent even a right time to worship. In Christianity, the place of worship is within us and everywhere, and the time to worship is always because of that. And so it shifts from you have to go up to Jerusalem or up a hill. But again we see when the real thing comes, the things of shadow pass away. So Jerusalem itself is a shadow of something else. And the holy city ends up being an image of how God lives within each one of us. God is present in the center of the temple, in the center of the city, as God lives now. When we live, God lives within each one of us. And we can set up and be a mighty fortress with strong walls that keep out intruders and evil. And we can be like Jerusalem. And so we can be the place to worship. And so which is why Jerusalem, the holy city, is not such an important site for us as Christians. It's extremely important for the history and for what happened there, but it is not important for our worship because the rules have changed. And though salvation is from the Jews, again, from Judaism, from God's chosen people and the rules that he put in place for them, comes salvation. Jesus used the old rules to save everyone. So salvation is from the Jews, but it is not now for us the same way. In Jesus, something new comes about. So, in summary, God gave his life to humanity and gave us rules, terms of service, so to speak, for how we go about continuing to have it. But we all had a problem because the rule is if you sin, if you turn away from, if you are disobedient to God, then you will die. And none of us avoid that. So the fundamental state of humanity in the world is death. And you see it is, nature reflects that. We see it. Death is in the world. Things die. And there is, as of yet, nothing that we can do about it. For all of our technology, things still die. And that is the governing natural state. But, well, yeah, again, getting ahead of myself. And the Old Covenant talks about and lays out certain pathways to try to mitigate or to deal with that, but ultimately it was ineffective at restoring the non-shadow version of life itself, which is living at peace in union and presence with God. And so here we all are. And as we talk about the solution to this problem and how we can live differently, one of the things I would challenge all of us to think about is the fact that Jesus didn't make this go away. The fundamental rule that sin leads to death, there's a pathway back, but he didn't make it go away. So when we look around in our world today and we see things that look more like death than like life, even in Christianity and even in the church, it's because we do all still have a part that we have to play. And as we will see, it is not an easy, again, simple, but not an easy path that we have. And it ultimately reduces, I'll spoil a little bit, but not too much, to we have to, in the way we live our lives and approach it, we can prefer nothing to Jesus Christ. If we have preferred anything to Christ, then we have turned from him in a way similar to what Adam and Eve did before. And it's him who will make us live and not us. And so when we turn from him, then we lose that immunity to death, that ability to come back to life. And so where we see life is where we see people living in imitation of and in union with Christ. And I think we see all too often in our world today, I fell into this for a long time. I thought, well, we live in a Christian society. We've got the church. Jesus has come. Like a majority of, at least the part of the world that I live in is Christian, so we're saved. But you look at how it manifests, how we behave as a people, and what it looks like, and it's not. John Paul II called it a culture of death. It is not life that is reigning in our world, which means we as Christians are not doing our job. We are missing the mark still in our world.
Before Jesus Christ came into the world, what did the Jews believe? And Jews now that have accepted Jesus Christ, what happens upon death?
I think that there was some, and I am no expert on all of that, and I will start my answer by saying I'm not entirely sure, and then I'll tell you what I think I know and stop there. One of the things I'm trying to work on doing as I work to grow in humility is not pretending like I know something I don't, and I don't. But there was an argument among the Sadducees and the Pharisees about whether there was any kind of resurrection from the dead, even at the time of Jesus. So by then there was already dissent among Jewish thinkers about whether there was immortality or whether this life is all that we get. So already by the time of Jesus, Jews in general had no consistent answer to that question. It could be either way. And I imagine that has persisted, but I'm far from any expert. I would guess that it varies by Jewish sect and background.
And yet in the Psalms, there are references to a surviving soul.
Well, that was the argument, one of the arguments between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the old joke is, why were they sad? You know, the Sadducees did not believe in immortality, and so they were sad, you see. And that's how you remember which one was which.
That is how I still remember that.
But then after the time of Jesus, the Jewish faith underwent some pretty good changes, including that we don't really have Jewish priests. We've got rabbis, which indicates that the Pharisees sort of won that battle on who's got control of Judaism. So that would suggest, again, I don't know any more than Matthew does about this, but it would suggest that that line of thinking, the Pharisees' side, was stronger. But whether it still is, I don't know. Whether there are factions that lean the other way, I do not know.
And just maybe following up your thoughts on this, where it says salvation is from the Jews. The Jews were the chosen people, and I assume today they are still the chosen people. They remain, Jews are the, John Paul II said, Jews are our older brothers and sisters.
And we pray for them on Good Friday specifically.
Pray for them.
We always pray for their
We
conversion.
don't pray for their conversion,
Yeah.
but we pray for them. Any thoughts on that?
The book of Revelation actually talks about the 144,000 being called as the world is ending. 12,000 from each tribe. Before it gets to the vast multitude of people who have cleansed their robes in
The blood of the Lamb.
of the Lamb. And I think that is a description of the chosen people being called to participate on the side of not getting really horribly destroyed by God at the end, and being also again called and chosen still at the end.
So that reference is strictly for the Jews?
I think so. Everybody else has the Christian doorway, and it seems to have been open too far. More is the implication there, but that the chosen people remain chosen and are. You could read that passage that they find a slightly different way to the same salvation than all of the Christian people, and are nonetheless invited to participate. They never stop being chosen, and God has a plan for them. And the fact that they didn't or don't all recognize Christ is clearly, from our point of view, not ideal. If nothing else, then Jesus makes it easier. There is and I will say the exact opposite of that tomorrow. I'll say Christianity is harder than other things in terms of what we have to do, but the help is greater as well. So that I think while it is quantitatively more difficult, it is functionally and in a lived way becomes easier, even so. And I think we will, at least I hope that's true. But as a Christian, I'm more worried about me because I'm selfish. And I figure they can work out their salvation, and God has not left them behind.
It's interesting in that context to think about Judaism as not a mission faith. They're not looking for converts, and that is true still. They're very small as a religion. They're the chosen people, and it's kind of like they do have some special status that remains.
Well, yeah, God of all beings doesn't go back on choices.
Is it proper to say that the Christians are the new chosen people? Or is that not correct? I thought I've heard that somewhere. Christians are
grafted
the
in.
new.
Yeah, I can see how someone could say that and not be wrong. I can see how someone could say that and be wrong. As with so many things in the faith, it probably merits some qualification. St. Paul, in the letter to the Romans, does talk about how we are called and chosen Christians and how lucky the Christians are. If you think about his point in time, all of human history up until like 10 years ago had been not Christian and had not had Jesus. And so from his point of view, if you're one of the few people who lived during the time and space and area of Jesus and happened to buy in and accept, you were one of the very few chosen and called people. And so in those early days, it was quite a privilege and a blessing to be called, as it remains today. So they talk about being called and chosen as Christians as well. I think they talk about it as in a different sense than the sense of the chosen people as a people. The new covenant, I think, is offered for everyone who knows about it. There are still people who, in high school I had an argument with a girl who was an evangelical Christian who just could not accept the idea that people in tribes in the world today who are living off in islands and who've never had the gospel preached to them, she was adamant that they would still go to hell because they didn't believe in Jesus specifically. I don't think that probably makes a lot of sense. But the new covenant is intended to call everyone, so that there is no longer a subset of people. It's intended to be something that isn't, and that's part of
the human race at large.
Yeah, part of why it's so important that we preach the gospel is to make that salvation available to all peoples, because it is inherently, God made it for everyone. So we both are and are not special because we're Christians. We're special in terms of the gift that is being offered to us. We're not different from everyone else that is being offered to everyone.
Alyssa, when I'm writing, I would be very, very hesitant to use the phrase new chosen people, because I know that I'm going to send everything through an imprimatur, and I don't think it'd pass just loose by itself. I am not afraid of the idea of the new Israel. That's sort of an expansion on what you're talking about. We're all part of the new Israel, but I'm not sure we could say we were new chosen people. And that's a fine distinction, but that's the kind of distinction you run into with the church doctrine stuff. So I'd be leery.
New chosen people.
Yeah. Yeah. We are called and chosen. That's each of us individually, and everybody is. But
and just as a plug, since we are on retreat and there is a purpose beyond just learning here, and I won't get to, will not be opportune for me to make this plug tomorrow when I get to the full idea of it, because the time will have passed. We do have confession available tonight. If you're hearing this and you're thinking, well, maybe I'm over here, so one of the ways we have built in to
Get over there.
get back onto the side hopefully we all want to live on is that. So you will have the opportunity this evening to go to confession. And anybody who's concerned about where they sit there is highly encouraged to participate.